Okay, good morning. My name is Dan Lashoff. I am the U.S. Director at the World Resources Institute. Welcome to our webinar on Revitalizing Rural America, how climate-smart investments can boost economies across the United States. This could not be happening at a more important time. Congress is debating right now a major infrastructure investment, including key investments in rural America. We're going to start off with a conversation with Senator Martin Heinrich from New Mexico, in conversation with Christina DiConcini, WRI's Director of Government Affairs. I will turn it to them in just a minute. Following that, we will have a presentation of the results of a new study that WRI has released today, which quantifies the economic opportunities in rural America from a suite of investments. And then we'll have a really dynamic panel discussion of a range of opportunities covering clean energy and grid, natural climate solutions, and fire protection and energy efficiency. So thanks for joining us. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Christina and Senator Heinrich.
Whoops. Thank you, Dan, so much. And above all, thank you, Senator, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And but more than anything, I just want to really say thank you for being really one of maybe the biggest climate champion there is in Congress or among the very top, and your unwavering commitment on these issues across the board that never let up. And we appreciate it so much. If people aren't familiar with the senator, they need to become so. You can see op-eds he's written on Earth Day with other climate senators. His website is full of all the climate activities. He sits on the very powerful Appropriations Committee and the Energy Committee, Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He's part of a special climate caucus, and the list goes on and on. So without further ado, I want to ask you a couple opening questions. But the first one really is that anybody who's watching this, like probably almost everybody is on this webinar, we have more than 300 people on, what's the latest? What is the latest in this endless negotiation? And importantly, thank you so much for the advocacy that you have been doing and your voice on saying that we need all of the investments in the American Jobs Plan that are climate related, all of them, to become law in 2021 in some vehicle. So both what's the latest and what's your prediction on that happening, being able to win all those climate investments, given the politics and everything else? Thanks.
Well, I think the latest, it continues to be fairly complicated, and it's a little hard for the public to watch because we're doing two things at one time. We're working on an infrastructure package that has to hold 60 plus senators together, that is going to be bipartisan. And there's the world of what we can accomplish inside that infrastructure package. And that's really important. I think we leveraged a number of gains there that were certainly by no means givens. Things around making sure that we're using natural landscapes as carbon sinks, really restoring our forests. The transmission pieces of that were incredibly important. I think it's highly underappreciated how much our current transmission system acts as a check on being able to do more clean energy, to be able to clean up our grid, and to really be able to squeeze a lot of emissions out of our electricity sector at the moment. And so the improvements that were included there were a battle, but they're in there, and I think that's a major accomplishment. But at the same time, we have to have this and are engaged in this parallel process of what does our long-term budget look like? How does that invest through the reconciliation process? That's a world of getting 50 votes on the same page, but we have very widely dispersed caucus members from very different regional and energy mix backgrounds. And so making sure we have structural investment there in things like the clean energy standard, things like If, you know, that has to survive the reconciliation process, and we're doing the work now to make sure that that is budget reconciliation compatible. We're looking at investments in how do we decarbonize by electrifying light duty transportation through that process, building out the EV infrastructure, investments in electrification of buildings and homes, because probably somewhere in the order of 37–40% of our carbon footprint is stuff we still burn inside our own buildings, which is not healthy. And it's all stuff we can do better today. We have better technology. And if we smooth out some of those friction points, we can really decarbonize today without all that R&D stuff that you always hear about, like someday we're going to solve these problems. This is stuff we can solve now. Let's invest in the 80% solutions and really move the needle while we still have a little bit of time. I'm relatively optimistic right now that we're going to get through both of these processes. What proportion of those investments stay in budget reconciliation is an open question, but I think it'll be substantial. I've never seen more conversation around climate, and I've never seen the Democratic caucus more united around the necessity of moving quickly and addressing the very, we've just seen this summer, whether you're in North America, whether you're in Siberia, whether you're in Europe, the extreme weather events that we're already experiencing are beyond what our models are predicting, and we have to act now.
Okay, thank you. I meant to tell everyone listening that at about 10 minutes before we're going to wrap up this 30-minute engagement with the senator, we're going to take questions from people that you can put in the chat. So I forgot to say that. Well, that is encouraging that you're feeling so optimistic on both fronts, because those of us on the outside looking in, we just hear these little dribbles of the text says this, the text says this on things, and sometimes alarming, sometimes not. But anyway, that's really great to hear. And I hope that you're right, that both of them can go through with all the power that is necessary. WRI is releasing a paper today called The Economic Benefits of a New Climate Economy in Rural America. And it models all sorts of policies that are wrapped up in the American Jobs Plan, in the infrastructure plan, including transmission, which is one of the things you have spent so much time on, sponsored a number of bills on, distribution, energy efficiency, storage, all sorts of things with. And it not surprisingly shows from this modeling that it creates a lot of really good jobs. And we specifically focus this paper on rural America just because the politics around this are often such that people think that's not a place that can gain jobs from climate action. And I know this is right up your alley, because I have a quote here. I think it's from your website talking about New Mexico specifically with its abundant wind, solar resources, should be the center of the American clean energy economy. And if you are making these decisions, how that will help so much grow the economy and also address, or help prevent some of these horrible climate impacts that we are seeing everywhere, including New Mexico. I'm from Arizona, so I'm tuned into the whole Southwest problem there. But so can you speak a little bit to both the job creation piece, and also how do we get this message further elevated and amplified? Because we constantly hearing, oh, it'll cost jobs, it's going to cost the economy, when we know the facts, our modeling, but all other evidence points to the facts too, that in order to stay competitive, we have got to build towards tomorrow's economy, not yesterday's economy. But as you know, there's, it's a kind of divided thing where it seems like it should be a no-brainer. So if you could speak to that and how you think what we need to do to get that more clearly out there, that this is a job creator.
I think one of the things that we really need to do to shift that conversation, the debate, the narrative, is to do a better job of just lifting up individual stories. And people respond to real life situations and the stories of people's jobs and their lives in a way that they don't respond to data and to studies and to all the things that, most of us as policymakers are highly responsive to. And so if you just look at New Mexico as an example, from that lens of both renewable generation, clean energy, and then also the fact that we talked a little bit about transmission, there's one transmission line in particular that I've been working on for over a decade now that is likely to be resolved in the coming months.
Mhm.
That transmission line, that single transmission line, opens up billions of dollars worth of wind generation. And when that happens in my state, the wind doesn't go in the urban areas. It doesn't go in the Rio Grande corridor. It's not around Las Cruces or Albuquerque or Santa Fe. It goes in a large number of communities that have actually seen a fair amount of depopulation over the course of the last century. So small towns like Corona, New Mexico, where suddenly you are going to have people making $50,000, $60,000 a year when, with the exception of the person working at the post service and maybe the local electric co-op, there are no jobs like that in town. And so having the fact that for every 5 to 7 wind turbines, you're going to need a wind tech who is going to put their kids in the local school, build the tax base. That is a game changer for some of these small rural communities where these investments are occurring. And I think we just need to do a better job of lifting up those stories. It's in the urban areas. I actually think a lot of the jobs that are going to be most helpful to the economy are the folks who drive panel trucks, who are plumbers, who are electricians, who are going to help us completely clean up the infrastructure of our homes and buildings as we move to heat pumps, to heat pump water heaters. And those are high quality, blue collar jobs that pay an awful lot for someone who's got good training, probably doesn't have a college degree, but has good career technical training. And those jobs are really important for stability in all the other areas. So it's a matter of articulating what those jobs are that we're going to see grow, and then tell the stories of individuals who are doing that work.
That's really helpful. We are a research organization that, researches things to move policy forward. So we're pretty big on the data and study part of it, which obviously is really important, as you said, and policymakers depend on it all the time. But the individual stories really are what people pay attention to. And we've kind of seen how in the previous administration, they were able to make a lot out of individual stories that really didn't exist there very much on some of those things. So that's really a good impact. Good insight. I wanted to also ask you, you talked about it a little bit in your beginning, but to hit on specific parts of that you want to see that make it into reconciliation, that move the climate needle forward, that aren't in the bipartisan infrastructure proposal. So what those investments? So
I think the clean energy standard is a really key piece of that. And, we're going to have to, if we can't keep that vis-a-vis budget reconciliation rules, we're going to have to replace it with another structure, whether that's a climate carbon pollution tax or some other structure, to be able to make sure that we have a way to drive emissions down over time and have our economic incentives lined up. I also think the investments from an industrial policy point of view in things like EV charging stations and electric vehicles writ large is going to be absolutely necessary to be able to, move our transportation sector, which has become the single largest source of emissions as the electric generating sector has declined in their emissions, continues to go down at a very steep rate, faster than anything else in our economy, I think. Transportation is going to need our focus. And so those investments are absolutely critical as well. Things like a civilian climate corps, where we can really put people back on the landscape and make sure that our natural solutions and our our forests, our farms, our landscapes are sequestering as much carbon as possible and not being part of the problem, right? When you see fires like you see in Oregon right now, that's taking a landscape that was sequestering carbon and suddenly it's the reverse. It's actually a huge emitter. And so preventing that sort of thing can be accomplished through investments in the budget reconciliation process. And then something I'm really a big fan of, and something that I've put forward, is just realizing what a huge portion of our emissions footprint can be eliminated by the 8 or 9 decision points in an individual's personal life when their water heater goes out, when their stove dies, when their furnace conks out, or when they buy a new vehicle. That sort of constellation of machines, as you electrify them, and as the grid is already cleaning up so that the electrons on the grid are cleaner and cleaner, you really drive down emissions rapidly. And that can be accomplished in a pretty straightforward way by financing those things through DOE and through the budget reconciliation process to create some rebates for consumers so that they can make the decision that's already in their long-term economic interest.
Great. I wanted to touch on one thing, and then I think we'll switch to some questions. One is that when you talked about, which we're very supportive of WRI, of a price on carbon, we're very supportive of a clean energy standard. We support what can move emissions down the fastest, that's politically viable. So when you mentioned whether or not the clean energy standard can get through the parliamentarian, and I know there's like 1,000 papers and points of view on that. And if that doesn't happen, moving to something like a price on carbon, a tax on that. And I wanted to just touch briefly on the opposition to that from some in the environmental community that don't think that it adequately addresses concerns in their communities. And if you wanted to just respond to that briefly.
Absolutely. I think that, in my conversations with frontline communities, and New Mexico is a case study in frontline communities. I mean, we have places like the Navajo Nation that historically were very reliant on coal mining and on electric generation from coal. And then we have communities where oil and gas impacts are enormous. And then we have communities that deal with the industrial impact of all of those things, of refineries, et cetera. I think what people are most worried about is it just becomes a big trading scheme for Wall Street, and it doesn't positively address the very real problems in their lives. And so if we were, for example, to move forward on a carbon tax, it would be in my interest in a very visceral way to make sure that those dollars find their way back to those frontline communities to clean up and fix these problems and to create the new, cleaner jobs, the better jobs of the future. If that money just gets, used to pay for this and we don't address those problems, I would have a very serious problem with that sort of approach as well.
Great. And I'm sure you're familiar with the kind of innovative approach that Senator Whitehouse and you.
I've been working with Senator Whitehouse and Senator Schatz on that.
That you're not only aware of it, you're part of it. That is really trying to put together something that does that.
And I think those are very, very legitimate critiques of not wanting something that glosses over the historic problems that we have an opportunity right now to actually address.
Yes, and that bill is so interesting because in addition, it puts a price on the criteria pollutants and the pollutants that really have been affecting those communities in those communities. But okay, so switching now to a few questions from our audience. So audience, if you have questions, put them up in the chat and they'll get to me. So one is, how do you guarantee that federal funding will end up supporting local rural ownership and control, and people living on the margins of this kind of big investment? How do how do you make sure that happens?
I think you have to call out and direct investments to rural communities, to frontline communities, to minority communities, and not just assume that the administration, if you fund them, that they're going to make all the right decisions. You really do have to structure things, and we learned this in the response to COVID. And I'm proud to say that we made a shift from the CARES Act, where when we were responding to COVID, the investments in some of the communities that are most challenged in my state was not adequate. And then when we did the American Rescue Plan, the investments, for example, in tribal areas that were really deeply impacted by COVID at a disproportionate rate were dramatically larger. And we had to call that out. We had to very specifically and intentionally make sure we make those investments. And we're having that conversation more and more, and we're structuring it into these programs. And, I think a big part of our challenge in this country is that urban and rural, for example, communities have become disconnected with respect to information and with respect to economics. And so the investments that we can make with something like budget reconciliation, not just in climate, which is really important, and we can make those jobs happen in rural America, but things like broadband that then open up new and real economic opportunities that were already there for urban America in the rural communities, and build up a vibrant rural economy again. We have some real opportunities to do things better than we've been doing them for the last 30 years.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, are there does it make it more difficult if you're doing it through reconciliation because you can't put in all this specific legislative language that
Right.
would
It is more challenging, the budget reconciliation process, but it also goes along with the appropriations process that we go through on an annual basis. And you try to carry as much of that into the appropriations process so that you can be very deliberate.
Okay, I'm going to get to an audience question, but do you see, this is something I want to know, I've been talking to people about, do you see in this reconciliation version like they did in the CARES Act, do you think they would do appropriations and authorization in reconciliation this time, or you don't know?
It depends on what we have the votes for.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well now, keep going with the questions from the audience. So one is, what's the best messaging? And I don't really know if the word messaging, but about that clean energy jobs pay less, are less likely to be union than jobs in fossil fuel industry. I know recently, someone I know was in West Virginia, and they were talking to people who had worked in the coal jobs, and they were extremely well paid. Like some of these people were saying they made $80 an hour.
Right.
And so I was just curious what, I'm not just me, but somebody in the audience, what your thinking is about how to deal with that, and how do we deal with that in an investment strategy that we're trying to move forward, both in the bipartisan approach and also reconciliation. How do you make sure those policies get to be part of it?
Well, I think one, we have to set labor policy, which is beyond the budget and reconciliation process, but we have to be willing to set labor policy as a Congress and through the administration that supports organized labor. And we've had a 30-year retrenchment of undercutting the ability of people to organize in these sectors. And so you had historic sectors. It's less about coal mining than about whether a sector was organized 50 years ago and still exists today. And so one of the things that I've done is really engaged organized labor for some of the transmission work that we're doing. And it's a path to actually getting transmission built in a very difficult environment. Having those organized labor unions like IBEW at the table, having the trades with a real buy-in to see a line finished, that's one of the ways you build the widespread support to be able to actually do and build big things in America again. We've gotten to a place where it's very hard in the United States to do the kind of big things that we were known for in the 20th century. Having those labor unions at the table and bought in and part of, directly benefiting is a way we get back to that.
Right. That's seems to me such an important point too, that we can't solve climate without building things. So if we're going to build things, we want to do them in ways that are good for workers. All right, we have, I think, probably just one last question, and then we'll wrap it up and let you get back to your busy day, I think. So the question is, especially, New Mexico is obviously an oil and gas state, among other things. And how do you see addressing existing residents who work in quote unquote unclean energy, such as oil, being able to retain work in clean energy? And the other part of the question is, will clean energy jobs require more training and education than lower income residents might have? And it's not there's a lot of pushback when people say, oh, you'll just stop working in this,
I know where you're going. Yeah.
And you'll just be working on windmills tomorrow. So stop complaining. So how do you deal with that?
I think the solar analogy is actually more destructive because there is a lot of some crossover between things like oil and gas development and offshore wind, for example. But this idea that, oh, you're just going to put solar panels on someone's house tomorrow, you will never hear that come out of my mouth because it is so much more complicated, the changes in our labor force that we're going through. And finding what is the right solution for the future economy, and making sure it's a place-based solution that actually matters for that community. We cannot paint in broad brushes with this transition. And I think what's really important is just to be honest with people and say, this transition is occurring today. I mean, I was on the phone with a CEO of an American oil and gas major earlier this morning, and we were talking about the transmission. There's no doubt in his mind that this transition is occurring. So be honest about that. Be honest about what that means for changes in jobs in the labor force, and then very intentionally start coming up with additional strategies for those communities. And some places that's going to include a bunch of utility scale solar, or some rooftop solar, or some wind technicians that make sense for those communities. But in a lot of cases, that's not going to be what fits. I think one of the places where there is an enormous amount of overlap with the skill set of oil and gas is the need for some hydrogen component to our economy to deal with the very hard to decarbonize sectors like industrial heat, for example. And the oil and gas skill set is very analogous to how you control a lightweight gas like hydrogen. And so having investments now and training now and start thinking about that in those workforces, so that as we create some hydrogen hubs, that those people are working in the jobs, the clean jobs of the future, that's a logical place-based solution to some of these basics.
Great. Well, I guess we want to wrap it up. I want to make sure if you want to say anything else, to please do so. If there's anything we can do to help you, but most of all, thank you for your truly tireless fight on these issues. It matters a lot. I feel like we don't get to say thank you enough, and it is, you have 300 people on this call, and I'm sure they all want to say the same thing. Thank you so much for that, and please do everything you can to get the bipartisan bill to be as clean and green as possible, and as much in the reconciliation. And would you like to say anything else in your closing remarks?
I just want to say thank you, and please keep pushing, because we all need to feel the pressure to get this done and to get it done well. We're at a really critical tipping point for these policies and for our planet, frankly. I mean, we're seeing the consequences of inaction in very visceral, painful ways right now. And that should motivate all of us to double down on the places where we can make progress.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a million. And we'll be in touch. And thank you to your staff and everything you're doing.
And as an engineer, thank you for your great data.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Christina.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks to Senator Heinrich. That was amazing. I don't know if there are any other senators who could move so seamlessly from heat pump water heaters to labor standards to frontline communities. And I think there are not too many engineers in the Senate. I wish there were more, certainly more like Senator Heinrich. So that was amazing. Thank you, Christina. So now, please continue to add questions to the chat. To the Q&A feature. We've gotten quite a few in. Obviously, we weren't able to get to all of them for the senator, but we'll try to get back to some with the panel and to our WRI colleagues. At this time, I'm going to ask Tom Sears and Haley Leslie Bowl to present very quickly the findings of the study that we released today. This is really a very quick summary, and encourage everybody to go to wri.org to get the details, download the study, take a look at the interactive charts, but this will give you a taste.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. So yeah, as Dan mentioned, I'll be presenting along with Haley on our research findings from this paper, which demonstrates some of the potential impacts that we can see from climate infrastructure investment, like that which is being discussed right now in Congress and which we discussed during Christina and Senator Heinrich's conversation just now. And before getting started, I also just wanted to mention that this research paper, The Economic Benefits of the New Climate Economy in Rural America, was a major collaborative effort which builds on WRI's New Climate Economy and Build Back Better work, and involved partnership with BW Research, who provided economic impact modeling expertise, as well as many other stakeholders on the ground who provided a tremendous amount of data and insights without which this wouldn't have been possible. So we can skip over to the next slide. So I'd like to start off here just with the context for this work, which is that rural counties in the US represent both a challenge and a major opportunity when we're considering clean energy infrastructure and other climate-friendly investments. The challenge is that rural counties in the US face disproportionately high levels of unemployment, poverty, worker mobility, and energy burden relative to urban areas. And these disparities have been worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, rural economies, as discussed earlier in this event, across the country are already facing adverse impacts from climate, such as catastrophic wildfires, flooding, and record-breaking droughts. On the other hand, the opportunity is that rural America stands to reap major benefits from the transition to a cleaner economy. The vast majority of US wind and solar capacity, for example, is and will continue to be sited in rural areas. And natural and working lands, which are largely located in and around rural areas, act as a major carbon sink in the US, actually sequestering roughly 12% of gross US annual GHG emissions. And this can be further enhanced through investments. So next slide. So with that framing in mind, in our analysis, we've evaluated 7 opportunities for what we refer to as a new climate economy for rural America. In other words, these are investments that can stimulate economic growth while addressing climate change. And these 7 investment pathways we evaluated are renewable energy, energy efficiency, transmission, distribution, and storage for the electric grid, cleanup and remediation of abandoned fossil fuel infrastructure, tree restoration on federal and non-federal lands, and wildfire risk management. I should note that these 7 pathways represent key opportunities that we identified, but it's important to note that they are not intended to be exhaustive of everything that needs to happen on climate, but rather a good illustrative set of both energy and land investment opportunities. So next slide, please. So real quickly, in terms of our approach here, there were basically 3 steps. We identified pathways mentioned in the previous slide. We calculated the opportunity and investment potential for each of these pathways based on historic funding levels or recently proposed expansions of policy, as well as relevant regional data. And then third, we modeled economic impacts using, in this case, the in-plan input-output model, quantifying impacts of investment resolved at the county and state level. And one additional methodological note here is that rural, for the purposes of our analysis, was defined as all counties that are non-metro areas according to USDA's classification system. And investments were allocated to these areas based on the nature of the investment opportunity, historic funding patterns, and other data. So that's necessarily a very high level overview, but a detailed methodology can be found in the appendix to our paper that was released today. Next slide, please. And the next one. So we're now moving on to results. Our main findings is that of $55 billion in annual investment over a 5-year period, some $15 billion of that would flow directly to rural counties. This investment would sustain roughly 260,000 jobs each year for a cumulative total of 1.3 million job years. It would also generate $21.7 billion per year in overall value added to rural economies, which includes employee compensation and local, state, and federal tax revenues. And this represents an excellent return on investment. We found that for every $1 million invested through the new climate economy pathways included in this analysis, it would generate 17.5 jobs and $1.5 million in additional value added in rural economies. And that's without considering the social cost of carbon and the value of avoided emissions. Next slide, please. So we also find that these benefits would be well dispersed across rural counties all across the country. And in terms of the top 5 states, just looking at absolute total job creation, these would be California, Texas, New Mexico, Missouri, and Wyoming, each of which would benefit from a combination of investment across multiple pathways like renewable energy, grid transmission, wildfire risk mitigation, and reforestation. And while these states make up a large share, it's important to note that benefits are, again, generally widely distributed, and different regions emerge as major beneficiaries depending on the investment opportunity that we're looking at. Next slide. So with that, I'll hand things over to Haley, who will go through our results by sector in a little bit more detail and discuss some of the equity considerations around impacts for economically disadvantaged counties. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tom. So as Tom mentioned, we looked at 7 areas of investment, and here I'll sort of talk through sector-specific results at a high level. Next slide. And I just want to note here that in the working paper, we do have detailed state level results for both rural and national economic impacts. So I encourage you to explore the results in more detail there. But in the energy sector investment areas here, you can see that job creation, like Tom said, really is distributed throughout rural areas across the country. And in the energy sector investment areas we analyzed, if you look at the geographic distribution of jobs, Massachusetts, California, Nevada, Maryland, and Arizona are states with the largest job impacts relative to the size of their rural economies. And then looking at each sector specifically, you can see that while job creation for transmission, distribution, and storage and energy efficiency are distributed somewhat evenly, some of the states that light up for the remediation of abandoned fossil fuel infrastructure, for example, Pennsylvania and West Virginia, are states that are suffering from the decline of fossil fuel production. And so these findings indicate that the investments in this area may help to ensure a more just transition away from fossil fuels, as Senator Heinrich was discussing. And apart from supporting jobs and adding value to rural economies, which you can see in the table shown here, investments in many of these energy sector areas would also help to lower the cost of energy for rural Americans and to help rural areas benefit from the current expansion of the renewable energy sector. And this analysis, as Tom mentioned, we based energy sector modeling on a basket of policies that would serve as vehicles to transfer federal investments to rural communities. The panelists will really speak more to this, but some of the policy needs for the sectors mentioned here include expanding investment tax credit and production tax credit for renewable energy, enhancing incentives for home energy efficiency upgrades, Also expanding grant and loan programs aimed at rural areas through the USDA's rural development programs. And also we need to establish some new programs such as funds for plugging, remediation, and remediating abandoned oil and gas wells. Next slide. So the land sector pieces that we analyze here offer not only huge opportunity for employment and economic benefit, but they can also offer benefits such as supporting healthy forests and helping to protect communities from the risk of catastrophic wildfires. And across the 3 land sector investment areas we consider here, California, New Mexico, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana have the highest number of rural jobs supported relative to the size of their economies. And these states I just mentioned light up with very high job creation because Western states tend to have high job creation potential from tree restoration on federal land and from wildfire risk management. But as you can see, actually the single highest job creation potential lies in tree restoration on non-federal land, or in other words, private state and local land. And the states with the highest rural job creation potential through investment in non-federal tree restoration include Missouri, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and Maine. And in terms of the policy needs and policy vehicles for federal investment in the land sector, there's definitely a need for increased funding for land management on federal lands, which includes providing more funds for reforestation and more funds for wildfire risk reduction treatments. And then on private lands, policy needs include expansion of USDA incentive programs like the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or EQIP, to provide payments directly to landowners, and the implementation of a carbon removal tax credit could also incentivize landowners to adopt carbon sequestering land management practices. Next slide. So one of the key pieces of our analysis here was looking at the ways that federal investments could benefit economically underserved rural communities. And over half of rural communities are either at risk or distressed, as defined by the Economic Innovation Group's Distressed Communities Index. And so in this analysis, we found that these economically disadvantaged communities would benefit from investments in the new climate economy. Rural economically disadvantaged counties would see about 118,000 jobs yearly, which accounts for approximately 45% of rural job creation potential from the investments we've discussed here. And the states that could see the highest numbers of jobs supported in rural economically disadvantaged communities would be California, Texas, New Mexico, Missouri, and Kentucky. But it's really important to note here, and Senator Heinrich touched on this, that federal investment needs to be accompanied by measures specifically designed to ensure that benefits reach disadvantaged communities. And these measures could include, just to name a few examples, workforce training programs, grant programs to support local businesses and nonprofits, and requirements that new programs are designed to be inclusive and accessible to all. And these measures would help ensure that the new climate economy really is accessible and equitable. Next slide. So before I hand it over to the panelists, I want to emphasize that the findings in this working paper really highlight the need for federal investment in a low carbon economy and the potential that these investments could have not only to address the widening economic gap between urban and rural areas, but to move the country really towards a net zero future. Next slide. Thank you so much, and I will hand it over to the panelists.
Thanks, Tom and Haley, for that presentation, and also want to really thank Devashree Saha, the lead author of this report, for all of her work here on it. She's available here, and if we have some technical questions that we get to, but at this time, we can take the slide down and turn to the panel. And I will briefly introduce the panelists and then start a discussion. So we have a great panel to discuss these issues. Amanda Woodrum is a senior researcher at Policy Matters Ohio and focuses on the intersection of health, equity, and the economy, and is co-director of the project Reimagine Appalachia. She joined Policy Matters in 2007. And Reimagine Appalachia initiative is a broad and inclusive coalition that includes folks from all the states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky, and has put together a blueprint to expand economic opportunity in the region while also addressing climate change. So welcome, Amanda. Second, we have Karen Whalen. Dr. Karen Whalen is the CEO of Gridwise, the Gridwise Alliance, and principal at KW Energy Strategies, where she provides strategic consulting on grid modernization and clean energy policy. She has served as a senior policy advisor, both at the U.S. Department of Energy and to the House Speaker. And I had the pleasure of working with her as a colleague back in the day at NRDC. So welcome to Karen. Tyson Bertone-Riggs is the Coalition Director at Rural Voices for Conservation. Tyson focuses on federal land management policy, particularly related to the U.S. Forest Service, and he's worked for state and federal land management agencies in Alaska, Wyoming, and Oregon. So brings some important expertise to the conversation on the land side. Welcome to Tyson. And finally, last but not least, Mary Shoemaker manages ACEEE's cross-cutting research, outreach, and convening on energy efficiency. And as a member of ACEEE's state policy team, she conducts research on technical assistance on state energy efficiency policies and program, including leading the work in Virginia. So it's a great panel. I'm going to start with some initial questions, and then we'll open it up and turn to discussion and questions from the audience. So let me start with Amanda. We heard Senator Heinrich, who comes from the Western U.S. And certainly a number of distressed rural communities there. You're from Appalachia, and that region has been dependent on coal jobs for decades, has seen a serious reduction in employment in that sector, both from automation as well as from the clean energy transition. It's no longer an engine of growth. But Reimagine Appalachia has a vision for a vibrant future for the region. Can you talk about the low carbon investments that you see that should be prioritized, and how that can create jobs and economic opportunities?
Sure. As you pointed out, Reimagine Appalachia really covers or focuses on what we call the Ohio River Valley region of Appalachia, aka coal country. And we got together in the context of national climate conversations with the idea that Appalachia needs to be at the table of those conversations, or it'll be on the menu. But if we are in fact at the table, we can make sure to turn this into a real opportunity to bring much needed resources into the region. Appalachia has long fueled the nation's prosperity, literally, while itself has been exploited by absentee corporations in the extractive industries. Our workforce has been exploited, our land has been damaged, and our workers and our neighbors have been left sick. So we believe we deserve a healthy share of any national climate infrastructure package. And we've, as you alluded to, laid out the blueprint for what that looks like. And at the end of the day, we want all the things everybody else wants. We need to modernize our grid. We need to expand universal quality broadband. We need to start by repairing the damage from the last century of extractive industry practices. That begins with reclaiming all the abandoned mines and capping oil and gas wells. It's about reforesting and the region and wetland restoration. But we also need a manufacturing strategy, and we actually think we can grow manufacturing in the region with the right investments. We're particularly excited about the idea of repurposing our shuttered coal plants and former steel facilities into industrial parks that are environmentally friendly, making some of the needed products for the next generation. We think Appalachia in particular could play a strong role in bioplastics. And we also think there's really good reason to believe that battery technology and energy storage are good fits with Appalachia. But as I mentioned earlier, the region itself is impoverished. We really should be one of the richest regions in the nation. We are abundant in natural resources, but we're not. We're one of the poorest, if not the poorest. Many of our communities are in the bottom 10% economically when it comes to the high unemployment rates, high poverty rates, and low incomes. These investments are critical. We cannot transform the region without significant federal investments. The region is basically an area of concentrated poverty. But if we get these investments, we've done the math. We can create over 500,000 jobs, essentially laying the foundation for a more sustainable economy that creates local wealth instead of enriching the pockets of absentee corporations. And that's what we're calling for. We want a very specific, thoughtful plan for Appalachia, and we believe we deserve it.
Thank you, and thanks for your work and the vision, how to create a brighter future for a region that, as you say, has fueled the economy of the rest of the country for decades, but has not seen all the benefits that it should. So we are, excited about the opportunity to bring investments that will help. You mentioned a couple of things that I want to turn to Karen to talk about, both broadband and clean energy investments. Karen, rural co-ops play a really important role in rural economies in Appalachia, but in other rural areas around the country. They're increasingly turning from coal to renewable energy investments as the economics improve. But there's also a big emphasis now on broadband. We learned the critical role of having every household connected to broadband internet as a result of COVID. Can you talk about how those two areas can potentially come together and what role the federal government could have to promote that?
Yeah, we're seeing a real convergence in the electricity sector between sort of the IT, telecom, and clean energy. And a lot of it has to do with the investments that utilities are making in their smart grid infrastructure, their internal communication networks, which are critical for having the grid be a platform for clean energy. So whether it's distributed energy resources or utility scale resources or grid integrated energy efficient buildings, we need a smart grid. And so what utilities are doing is upgrading their utility communication systems in order to be that platform. And when they do that, there are opportunities to, if they're building out a fiber network for their internal communications, or they're installing Wi-Fi, 5G Wi-Fi for that internal communication network, there are opportunities for them to overbuild that communication network and then provide broadband to their service territories. And we're seeing some of that happening in rural co-ops, with them actually spinning off businesses and providing broadband. But if we help them make the investments in their communication networks, not just the broadband, we'll get a twofer. We'll get both the kind of the smart grid that we need for a clean economy. And as your data show, those jobs are really good jobs. Building out the grid, modernizing the grid are good, high-paying jobs. Often they're union jobs. And there are going to be more jobs available than there are workers. And so this is a real opportunity both to build out a clean energy utility workforce and to look at equity and diversity issues as the workforce is changing, to build out this smart grid and to leverage broadband. And the benefits to rural communities in terms of those investments are not just about jobs. They are really allowing these rural communities to take advantage of the 21st century economy. And what we're seeing is a big shift in workers moving away from very expensive urban centers into smaller cities and communities around the country. And rural America has seen kind of an exodus of workers. We're only going to be able to attract workers back into rural America if they have access to this 21st century economy, which we can help make happen with these investments in utility communication networks that give us that twofer, that bang for the buck that I was talking about with clean energy and economic development.
Thanks, Karen. One of the challenges when people do move into rural areas, particularly in the West, is more construction in the what's called the urban rural interface, or fire zone, and we're seeing a lot of challenges with yet another record wildfire season in the West. Another connection to that is the fact that it appears that utility transmission lines are involved in starting some of these fires. So a lot of interest in clear necessity in improving fire management issues. We see job opportunities from that, but also in tree restoration. But Tyson, any of these land use decisions are controversial, particularly when we're talking about national forests. And so how can the federal government make sure that local voices are part of that decision-making process, and make sure that that leads to better outcomes that people are bought into?
Yeah, thanks for the question and for the opportunity to be here. I think you nailed it, that a lot of these decisions, particularly on public lands, can be very controversial. But luckily, we have seen over the last 10, 15 years, a real drive towards collaborative conservation and place-based conservation. For public lands, that can often look like collaborative efforts to plan public lands restoration projects, and to navigate those often socially contentious spaces where we can see management that has benefit both in terms of risk reduction, but also economic benefit to rural communities, at the same time that we are truly seeing restoration of ecological function. And I think unlike some of these other issues, I think with the lands issues, and in particular public lands, we're really talking about multiple benefits at the same time. This is both avoided risk and cost of things like wildfires, but also looking at the benefits of ecological restoration of forests and public lands. So it's definitely a complex space. And I think as we think about management of lands, both public and private, for carbon sequestration and climate change resiliency, it's all the more important to have that social component in there. Making sure that we're actually navigating that complex space. In terms of specific federal programs, the Forest Service in particular has been really good about engaging in and starting to invest in that kind of community collaborative planning approach. Programs like the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which has a number of essentially pilot landscapes around the country, is a great example of that, with collaboration really built into the policy itself.
Great, thanks. So last but not least, I want to turn to Mary. Many of these rural communities, in addition to limited economic opportunities, also face a very high energy burden, which is defined as the fraction of the income spent on energy services. Energy efficiency can play a big role in addressing that, but can you talk about what the challenges are of bringing energy efficiency to the rural areas, and what tools the federal government can use to overcome those challenges?
Sure, thanks for having me, Dan. As you mentioned, rural households have higher energy burdens than their metropolitan counterparts. ACEEE has found that number to be about 40% higher usually for rural households than urban households. And that number is even higher for low income and non-white rural households. And it's driven by a variety of factors like high poverty rates in rural areas and poor quality housing. A couple of the tools, I think, from the federal government that have been successful are two programs that I'll highlight from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Development. One is the USDA's Rural Energy Savings Program, which offers funding for utilities and other rural service providers for energy efficiency improvements. And then a second program from USDA is the Rural Energy for America program, which offers funding to agricultural and small businesses for both rural efficiency and clean energy improvements. So those two programs have been very successful. There are a couple of proposed federal tools that I also want to highlight that haven't come to fruition yet, but I think could be very promising. One is that the House FY 2022 appropriations bill proposes a DOE USDA interagency working group to examine energy technologies to support the agricultural sector, manufacturing, and look at energy and water efficiency opportunities. The Department of Energy is doing a lot right now on clean energy workforce development, and I think that coordinating closely with USDA could help ensure that those workforce programs are catered to and designed to meet the needs of rural households and workers. And then a second proposed tool, which is a big one, is President Biden's American Jobs Plan, which includes a lot of great provisions for rural communities and clean energy in those communities. For example, they talk in the plan about transitioning co-ops to clean energy. President Biden also talks about wanting to build next generation industries in distressed communities, which could include, but is not limited to, clean energy. And then lastly, one other thing I'll highlight from the American Jobs Plan is really highlighting the agricultural sector as a leader in our country's transition to net zero emissions. So I'm really excited about some of the current tools the federal government is using and the tools that Biden and Congress have proposed for the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Amanda, let me come back to you. I want to pick up on some of the issues Tyson talked about. I think often when we think about natural climate solutions and forest policies, we think about the West where there's more public lands. But you mentioned tree planting in Appalachia, as well as bioplastics as a possible investment pathway. So love for you to talk a little bit more about how you see that fitting into a vibrant economy in the region.
Sure. We're actually super excited about the idea of reviving the Civilian Conservation Corps, and have been working with Senator Casey in Pennsylvania. But, you know, huge areas of Appalachia have been clear cut. We've, you know, I think everybody's heard about, you know, some of the mountains tops we've blown off the mountains. And so there's, you know, there's huge need to invest in the natural infrastructure in the region. It's beautiful, Appalachia, but it's scarred, and we need to and should heal those scars. And we can put a lot of people to work doing that. And one of the things we're very enthusiastic about is that within a revived Civilian Conservation Corps, we can create a reentry program for returning citizens caught up in the war on drugs and the opioid epidemic, which has hit Appalachia particularly hard. So we've been working closely with Senator Casey on that piece of it. And it's a very exciting opportunity to break down the many barriers folks face if they have a criminal record.
Great, thanks. Yeah, the Civilian Climate Corps, I think, has gotten a lot of excitement and applicable all across the country. So that would be I think a great piece of this solution. I guess I want to Karen, come back to you now to talk about, you talked about sort of the clean energy and broadband piece. Can you talk a little bit about the energy efficiency component? That's where actually most of the jobs in clean energy currently are. A lot of that is certainly urban, but as Mary talked about, big opportunities in rural areas as well, and importance of making those investments. How do you see that fitting in, and do utilities have a role to play in promoting that along with broadband and clean energy?
Yeah, I mean, energy efficiency is critical. That has to be one of our first tools to address climate change, because the less energy you use, the less carbon you'll emit, and you'll be helping with the transition. And it's also for equity reasons. When we look at what happened in Texas with the cold snap that went through, the majority of the people who really suffered were in, and I think Amanda or Mary mentioned that low income people are living in poor housing stock. And if we can invest in helping make buildings more efficient, residential buildings more efficient, we can actually lower the energy burden and also have that be our first line of defense against the climate crisis. So energy efficiency is critical, and the rural co-ops many of them have very significant investments in programs on energy efficiency, and also looking at low-income bills and their customers and figuring out how to help low-income customers lower their bills. They're doing really interesting customer engagement programs, for example, where letting customers use their phones to track their energy use, and a whole suite of programs. And I will say that the co-ops were early adopters of advanced meter infrastructure and automation, because their customers are spread out, across. They have a very low density of customers per line. So those investments in smart meters actually allow the co-ops to do innovative programs to interact with their customers in a way that they were kind of forefront ahead of some of the IOUs and others. So really, the energy efficiency is going to be critical. And I would say that, as we're making these energy efficiency investments in buildings, I think it's really important to think about how we can set the stage for buildings to become assets to the grid, so that we can harness the distributed energy resources that we're going to see. In rural areas, the co-ops have been at the forefront of looking at water heaters and energy efficient water heaters that they can then use as a distributed energy resource to provide energy back to the grid. So it's important to think not just about energy efficiency, but how we might harness the assets behind the meter in buildings in rural areas to provide services to the grid.
Great. I'm glad we got back to smart water heaters, and it's, again,
Yeah.
Not that often that a U.S. senator talks about heat pump water heaters. So glad to pick up on that piece. Tyson, I actually want to ask you about the role that wood products might play in this energy efficiency. There's a lot of discussion about cross-laminated timber playing a role, and maybe revitalizing some of the Western forest communities could be a benefit for energy efficiency, and it's seen as a lower carbon material than concrete or steel in larger buildings if it can be used there. And it's something that we've been really trying to understand, because on the one hand, that's a benefit. On the other hand, if you're increasing harvest and reducing the amount of carbon that's in the forest itself, you could see that increased harvest actually lowering carbon sequestration and being counterproductive from a climate point of view. Is that something that you have grappled with, and do you have a kind of view of the role that using, for example, maybe materials that are pulled out of forests to reduce fire risk, or other approaches to link the kind of fire management agenda and the energy efficiency agenda?
That's a great question. I won't pretend to be an expert on CLT or carbon accounting, but I think as we've discussed this within our coalition, and as information emerges, there are probably a couple of places where we can think about it pretty cleanly. For one thing, one of the easiest places to get carbon wins when it comes to forestry is simply increasing the rotation age, so leaving trees on the land for longer. And that really feeds into what kind of sustainable management practices a given forest might be instituting. So when you think about new and innovative wood products like CLT, even independent of the material itself and the potential carbon benefits there, it's probably important to think about where it comes from and how sustainable that forestry practice is. For private lands, or sorry, for public lands rather, I think you mentioned this, but a lot of this is also about removing fuel from the landscape. And so the carbon accounting there is probably more complicated, but there is probably a lot of benefit to be had. Where you can create dimensional lumber. That's great. We know there's a market for that. But there's also, I think, opportunity for especially local biomass power generation, which might also, and this is outside of my wheelhouse, but it seems like it feeds into general resiliency of the energy grid as well. But yeah, definitely a tricky space, and I think the details of the numbers do matter in terms of what the forest practices are, where that wood comes from, and ultimately things like distance to market and what would have happened to it otherwise. So complicated, but definitely promising. And CLT in particular seems like a great new building opportunity.
Thanks. Let me take an audience question. One of the Q&A questions is about the role of the private sector and what industries, what role specific industries can play in promoting the transition to clean energy, and how can they have a positive role. So I'll throw that open to anybody who wants to comment. I think it links to things that everybody's talking about, because clearly what we need both a strong government investment, but also the private sector to be a key engineer.
I can jump in. One of the reasons that we're advocating federal funding for investments in grid modernization that are often made by private entities is that a lot of the decisions have impacts on ratepayers, and they also have to be approved by state public utility commissions. And we think that there's a real opportunity here to accelerate investments in clean energy and grid modernization with some federal funding that helps kind of smooth the way, reduce any impacts on ratepayers, and also kind of make it easier for those policymakers who have to make decisions about investments to approve big projects that cost a lot of money. And so we do think that the infrastructure package that Congress is debating right now, a lot of that money will supplement and leverage private investments. And so you see from your research that for every dollar investment, you get multiplier effects that are as a result of those private dollars that are coming into the market as well. So there is a huge role, and we will not do this without the private sector investing their capital as well.
I'll chime in on that question as well and bring it back to a previous point that Karen made. But I think utilities are really important players in this conversation. Investor-owned utilities deliver billions in ratepayer-funded efficiency programs each year. And so they know what types of efficiency technologies and services their customers are going to need. As a result, I think they also have a good sense of workforce needs and what types of skills and training might be needed in order to prepare the workforce to deliver those measures. We've seen a number of utilities start inclusive energy efficiency workforce development programs to really make sure that people of color, that women, that returning citizens and former power plant workers can access and join the energy efficiency industry. And I think that those programs are ripe for replication with federal dollars, and that utilities are important to bring to this conversation and leverage the money that they manage, which is a lot of ratepayer money, but they're the ones who deliver it with approval from state regulators.
If I could just jump in on that, another opportunity in addition to energy efficiency and the grid modernization is cybersecurity. And the workforce needs are stunning in the utility industry. And so, targeted workforce development, which I believe the Department of Energy is looking at, and which we've been talking to Congress about, will also be good. And in the rural space, the rural co-ops, many of them will have like 10, 20 employees. They don't have a dedicated cybersecurity person. So there are a number of programs that we've been talking to Congress about funding through the infrastructure package, targeted at small and medium utilities to help them with their cybersecurity needs, which, as we move to more distributed energy resources being plugged into the grid, we're going to need to have that really robust cybersecurity. So there's a lot of job opportunities and economic development around protecting the grid too.
Let's stay on this issue of workforce issue. And Senator Heinrich talked about this a little bit, but I'd love to get the panel comments on what kinds of approaches can help the transition for workers who are currently or have been in the past employed in the fossil fuel industry, and this question of job quality in the clean energy industry versus in fossil fuel. So Amanda, we'll start with you, I think. Hopefully this is related to what you were going to talk about.
Yeah, we've done a lot of thinking about this. And at the end of the day, we're putting significant public investments into this. And we think that means it should come with community and labor standards. One, to ensure that coal industry workers actually have priority for jobs created. And I would say that the base skills, the foundational skills of many of these industry workers are applicable across a wide array, whether it's coal plant workers or coal miners. And that's a workforce that can pivot to the needs of the 21st century economy. And in fact, I would argue that we need them. We can't, in fact, do what we need to do without them. And so we are calling for community labor standards that prioritize coal workers, create on-the-job training opportunities for all these public infrastructure investments. And also that we're building a pipeline into union jobs for Black workers and other people of color. And at the end of the day, these really need to be good union jobs, and not enough to just create jobs. If you want to change, if you really want to build local wealth, we have to make sure that we're not just creating any jobs, we're creating quality jobs. And that's what's going to change really the paradigm shift that we need.
The UC Berkeley Labor Center has a great report on this topic called the High Road Climate Jobs. It is focused on California, and it's not explicitly focused on fossil fuel workers, but one great recommendation they offer is to train people for careers, not just for specific individual technologies, and really make sure that workers have opportunities for advancement. One tool that I really like on that kind of illustrates career trajectories in clean energy is from a group called IREC. They have career maps for solar, HVAC, and green buildings. It just helps to kind of visualize what entry level, mid-level, and advanced career or jobs might be in this industry.
Great. Yeah, that's really helpful. The other report I'll point to is a study that came out of the Princeton group, which looked at if, wages are, and I think we had a question about this as well, wages in clean energy are higher than the national average wage, but tend to be lower than fossil fuel jobs. But there's no inherent reason why a wind technician or a solar electrician job should pay less. And as Senator Heinrich said, it's mostly a function of the kind of history of organizing in different sectors. This Princeton study looked at what would the effect be of raising wages in the clean energy industry would it slow down the transition or significantly affect the cost of clean energy? And they found that it would not, that a 20% increase in wages in clean energy would have a really marginal impact on the cost of renewables and would not appreciably impact the ability to make the transition to clean energy that we need. So another data point, although again, as the senator said, data may not be the only way we need to communicate. We also have to have individual stories. So welcome anybody to offer those up as well.
Can I just emphasize one point you made? The union, the fossil fuel industry, was not inherently a good job. And in fact, the union movement started in this country in the coal mines in Appalachia. So we can do the same across all other sectors, and we should. And we should make it possible for any workforce to organize if they should choose to do so.
I also think it's really important when we think about workforce development that we aren't just targeting the kind of construction jobs, that we're not just, that when we are looking at frontline communities and trying to provide them opportunities, that we provide them with ladders to move up the economic opportunity within, any given industry, so that you're not just training them for the entry-level jobs, but you're training them for the industry so that they can move up and build generational wealth. That's going to be really critical for these frontline communities.
I would briefly add on to that I think this is particularly important to think about in the context of crafting new policy. It's not enough to just invest in the existing programs. We also need to think about administrative changes that are recognizing the importance of locally based jobs and jobs that are really pushing up the envelope for wages and pay. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, it's a great idea and a necessary first step in creating or bringing folks into that jobs pipeline. But just following up with what you said, Dr. Whalen, absolutely figuring out what those jobs are, the second, the third, those additional steps down the line, and really investing in the training and investing policies that are rewarding contractors and others that are really paying well.
Yeah, and to add on that, if you do it right, I think you treat the Civilian Climate Corps as a pre-apprenticeship program, and you created those programs with direct ties to union apprenticeship.
Right. So part of this job quality issue relates to kind of the mix of distributed energy resources versus utility scale, because at least historically, utility scale solar, for example, is more unionized than rooftop. I don't know if that, I think there's some reasons for that, because the labor requirements for doing rooftop are much higher, so it has a bigger impact on the cost. But we've had a couple of questions about views on how distributed the clean energy resources should be. What's the mix of really distributed resources versus more utility scale resources, and who will own these resources? On schools, if solar is on schools, or in a community, is community ownership versus utility ownership. So any thoughts about that question and how that plays out in different areas?
Well, from a sort of pure grid operations perspective, we're going to have both utility scale and distributed energy resources. And I expect that we'll see growing number of distributed energy resources. And, as we see a big build out in utility scale solar too. So what we need to make sure is that as those build out of both the DER and utility scale are happening, that we're also making parallel investments in the grid, so that the grid is the platform to be able to integrate both the distributed energy resources and the utility scale resources. And in terms of ownership, I think we're going to see a mix. And I think exploring that question around who owns the resources is going to be very important, because in some instances, it makes sense for the utility to own them. And in some states, utilities are not allowed to own those resources. In other instances, it may make sense for third parties to be able to provide those services, but we don't have third party providers, or the utility may have some resistance to having third parties provide those. So I think it's going to depend state by state, just because a lot of these rules are made at the state level. But the ownership question is tied very tightly to the finance question. So, is there a cost of capital difference between the potential owners, and does that make a difference in terms of the impact on the customers? I mean, there's a whole suite of things around ownership that need to be explored, and they're being explored in 50 different ways in 50 different states, and also at the local level too, given that we have a lot of municipal and co-ops that are publicly owned as well. So it's a great question, and I don't think there's a single answer on the ownership issue.
Great, thank you. So we just have a couple minutes left. I want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to make any closing comments, pick up on any questions that you see in the Q&A, and then we'll close it out. I will just note before we do that, the recording of this will be available on WRI's website. Check out the full report. We also have an op-ed on the Hill from me and Devashree Saha that highlights the findings of this in the context of the congressional debate. So urge you to check out those resources. Please share with your networks. But with that, let me turn back to the panel. Mary, I'll go in reverse order. Mary, I'll go to you.
Thanks. I'm really excited that WRI held this conversation and produced this report. I think that investments in clean energy in rural communities are really a chance to achieve local and federal economic, environmental, and equity goals. I think while we're going to see an abundance or an expansion of federal resources for rural clean energy and rural environmental solutions, I think the way those resources are deployed needs to be rooted in what works for individual communities. So I hope that we can really bring the grassroots and the grass tops together to actually improve the quality of life for rural Americans.
That's great. Tyson?
Yeah, I would just add on to that. I mean, the timing of this conversation is incredibly important with infrastructure and stimulus spending in the works. And I think the timing is right to be thinking not only about increased investment in some of these issues, but also how we structure those policies to be more equitable and to create that community capacity to help guide those locally or guide those investments locally.
Thanks. Karen?
It is a really critical time to have this conversation. And so thank you, WRI, for your report. I will recall working in Speaker Pelosi's office during the Waxman-Markey debate. And I think that one of the missing coalitions that was not at the table when we were having conversations about comprehensive climate legislation was rural America. And if we're going to have lasting solutions to the climate crisis, those solutions have to work for all 50 states and urban communities as well as rural communities. And so finding ways to make sure that the benefits of climate solutions, which we know there will be, accrue to rural communities as well, and that they are part of crafting the solutions and the policies is really critical. So your report could not be more timely as Congress is looking at this infrastructure package.
Thanks. Amanda, last word for you.
Sure. I would also agree that we are in a critical moment. We have to secure these investments, but we also have to make sure we get it right. The last 4 years have been incredibly divisive in getting it right, finding the common ground, and making sure that we're lifting up all communities and making sure workers have access to the new opportunities in climate infrastructure is really critical to paving the way forward to re-find our common humanity.
Thank you. With that, we are at the top of the hour, and I want to thank the panel again for participating. Really appreciate it. Also, thanks to Senator Heinrich and Christina DeConcini for that conversation, and particularly to the authors of this report, Devashree, Tom, Haley, and Greg Carlock, Alex, who is no longer at WRI, but made a big contribution. So thanks to everybody, and appreciate it. And with that, have a good rest of your day.